harsh words and very personal abuse. Reputations are in shreds as respected historians engage in a bare-knuckle brawl over Australia's past, who's accused several of his colleagues of distorting the truth. The orthodox view of our history, that the early settlers massacred thousands of Aborigines, is a fabrication. In the other, mainstream historians accuse reinventing the past, refashioning it to suit conservatives who don't believe white Australia has anything for which to apologise. Sunday's Helen Daly reports on black armband versus whitewash.
The orthodox or accepted history fed to students and readers by the leading historians of the last 30 years. That so-called black armband view, where there was widespread massacres, even attempted genocide of Aborigines by white British settlement, is a view Windschuttle himself once pushed as a left-wing academic.
For most of my adult life, I was a true believer of this story. I used to tell students that the records of the British in Australia was worse than the Spaniards in America.
These days, Windschuttle is a true believer no more. He says the story of mass killings of blacks by whites is just not supported by the hard evidence.
Despite its infamous reputation, Van Diemen's Land was host to nothing that resembled genocide. And of all the colonists that the Aborigines had, they were fortunate that they got the best colonists in the world, which were the British.
Windschuttle directly targets historians, including Professors Henry Reynolds and Lyndall Ryan, for peddling untruths about the extent of frontier warfare in Tasmania. His book painstakingly details their and others' mistakes and inaccuracies, which he claims they've used to prop up a story about the foundation of Australia that was a lie.
I found such a wealth of material, including some of the most hair-raising breaches of historical practice imaginable.
I think before we do anything, the first thing we've got to ask ourselves is, what happened?
But this is not just a debate in the rarefied halls of academia. It goes to the heart of what our children and young people are learning in school about how white colonisation affected blacks.
I guess we've all been taught that, the Aborigines were killed, there was genocide going on, and, stories of blankets being given out with, typhoid and things like that. I guess our understanding is that they were sort of massacred.
Well, I suppose during my schooling I've never actually been taught a specific definition of genocide, but I've just always been taught that there was genocide of the Aboriginal people since white settlement.
Well, it definitely suggests that genocide did occur, especially with Tasmanian
and that
Aborigines.
It was systemised,
And it was a
systematic.
Yeah.
These Year 12 students at an independent Sydney school reflect the view that Windschuttle so rejects.
I've always been told that there was genocide, especially with the Tasmanian Aboriginals. I mean, since I was 10 or so, from any form of schooling, there's been the eradication of all Aboriginal Tasmanians.
But the reality in the early days of the colony in Tasmania is that 73 years after white settlement, there were no full-blood Aborigines left. Everyone had died out, having existed there for well over 10,000 years before whites arrived. Do you appreciate that there's a tragedy about all this, that full-blood Tasmanian Aboriginals were wiped out within 73 years of settlement?
Well, of course, it's a terrible thing. I
mean,
who wouldn't think that's a terrible blot in the landscape? It's a tragedy in the sense that there was no way that a hunter-gatherer population who didn't have any kind of political control over their territory could hold that territory forever. Someone, either the British or the Indonesians, someone was going to come and take over Australia. Well, any of the people who were likely to do it were going to bring what the British brought, and that was diseases to which the Aborigines had no immunity.
How the entire full-blood Tasmanian Aboriginal race died out is central to Windschuttle's argument. Was it genocide? Windschuttle lumps all the so-called orthodox historians together and claims they say it was.
There was no genocide in Australia. The idea that Australia, as some writers have said, was the moral equivalent of Nazi Germany in its treatment of the Aborigines, I think that view is completely false. In fact, I think it's grotesquely false. The original settlers and the colonial authorities wanted to civilise and modernise the Aborigines. The last thing they wanted to do was exterminate them. There was no policy about this. There was no policy either at the government level or amongst the settlers themselves to wipe out the Aborigines, to drive them off the land.
I don't want to call it genocidal.
This is a central question as to, our children being taught that we killed them all. Now, did we?
They died of European disease. If we had not come, they would still be here. They died of European diseases. They died from European bullets. They died from eating European food. They died from starvation. They died as a direct consequence of us being here. I have never said we killed them. I don't know who ever did say we killed them.
But Professor Lyndall Ryan claims there was a conscious policy of genocide, including the infamous Black Line, which was in effect a human cordon of British troops and settlers designed to get rid of Aboriginals from areas close to white settlement. Governor Arthur also sent out roving parties in hot pursuit of Aboriginals.
I think if you go back to the sources and to the dispatches that Governor Arthur was writing back to England, he himself is aware that the government was in the end carrying out what I think Governor Arthur called the extermination of the Tasmanian Aborigines. He didn't want it to happen, but he could see that was what the outcome of his policy was.
So you call that genocide because you're saying there was some political intent to exterminate them?
The policy was, the outcome of the policy was that numbers of settlers being killed are increasing. So he's got to do something about it. So eventually the government does institute policies which must end in the deaths of the Aborigines. Governor Arthur realised there were not a lot of Aborigines left, and he was concerned that it would end up with them all being killed. And that's largely, in the end, what happened.
But even Henry Reynolds disagrees with Lyndall Ryan and has never claimed genocide occurred in Tasmania.
Two things. One, genocide is a crime of government. And two, there has to be an intent. There has to be an intent to kill a group of people, even if that isn't fully carried through. Now, in my view, the British government, that is the British imperial government, never had the intention to wipe out the Tasmanians, nor do I think Governor Arthur did. He was engaged in a war. He was willing to use as much force as was necessary to crush Aboriginal resistance, but this doesn't make it genocide. It makes it a form of warfare.
While he rejects genocide, Henry Reynolds stands by his highly charged assertion that the Black Line was an example of ethnic cleansing, a notion in the popular view associated with the killing fields of Kosovo.
I don't think the intention was to kill the Aborigines. The intention was to move them out of their own country. Admittedly, it's the centre of Tasmania, but it is their country. It is to move people from their ancestral homes, their country, and put them somewhere else. That is ethnic cleansing, by any definition.
When you say ethnic cleansing, to me and many people watching this, is what happened in Kosovo and Bosnia.
Well,
that is a very serious charge where people were routinely killed.
No. The killing was to frighten people, to drive them out, but the main process that Milosevic was to get them to move people out. And that is what Governor Arthur was doing. He was moving them out of their country.
While the whites were here as well.
It's an emotive charge Keith Winshuttle totally rejects based on the evidence.
The infamous Tasmanian Black Line of 1830 is described by Reynolds as an act of ethnic cleansing. However, if you read the documents at the time, its purpose was to remove from the settled districts only 2 of the 9 tribes on the island to uninhabited country, from where they could no longer assault white households.
Henry Reynolds himself was seen as a radical revisionist a few decades ago, when he challenged the then traditional view of colonisation by asserting that Aborigines were not just the poor victims unable to cope with white colonisation. Reynolds maintains Aborigines put up a spirited, organised defence of their homelands against whites, calling it guerrilla warfare. This 1940s Chips Rafferty film, Bitter Springs, depicts many of the tensions that led to skirmishes and often violent conflict between blacks and whites on the frontier. Conflict arose over traditional hunting grounds. And when settlers turned pastoralists, Aborigines retaliated by stealing sheep. But this celluloid depiction reflects more the view that Windshuttle would like us to return to, that whites only shot Aborigines in self-defence, in sporadic skirmishes on the fringe.
There was no frontier warfare. The Aborigines did not put up any kind of resistance to white colonisation. In fact, they were overawed, they were fascinated by the white people, they wanted to see the products they had, and the idea that they set up a kind of patriotic guerrilla warfare resistance to white invasion of their lands, which is the orthodox story that I'm criticising, in my view, there's no evidence for it. The evidence is, in fact, the opposite.
You say there's no frontier warfare, but there was frontier conflict. There were killings on both sides, and it got very bloody and violent.
Oh, certainly.
So, Windshuttle accepts there was indeed plenty of bloody confrontation, but he labels it a crime spree, refusing to call it warfare.
There's a government inquiry, and the overwhelming evidence from both the white side and from reports from Aborigines themselves, not written by them, but people reporting their words, is that their main aim was to steal flour, sugar, tea and bedding. And to them, these were luxury goods.
Well, that's just silly. That's just plain silly. As most of the military historians, Australia's leading military historians, see it as war. In fact, the most recent publication by the Defence Department on the Atlas of Australian War, the first chapter by Major General John Coates talks about the Black War in Tasmania both as war and guerrilla war. That is, most people who have studied this, who are military historians, consider it as war.
Henry Reynolds quotes some whites saying, they're engaged in guerrilla warfare, but the majority of white opinion was not of that kind at all.
The British government instructions to Governor Arthur were to treat the Aborigines, when they resisted the Europeans, as enemies of a foreign state. There's no doubt that it was war, and it was seen as war. It's also pretty clear that the Aborigines, certainly for some years, conducted a well-organised guerrilla campaign, and the evidence is overwhelming for that.
It's this interpretation of colonial conflict dressed up as contemporary guerrilla warfare that Windshuttle finds so disturbing.
What they've done is transferred a concept that was around in the 60s, a sort of radical leftist romantic concept from the 60s, and imposed that on the Tasmanian Aborigines in the 1810s and 1820s, where it just simply doesn't fit at all.
I come to my work with political viewpoints, and I can't take them off like a suit of clothes. But the important thing is you are upfront about it. You say what your political views are. The problem with Keith is that he is intensely political and pretends he isn't. And that's where the deception lies.
Well, my political agenda is that I think history has been spoiled by political agendas. I think the politicisation of history has been a disaster for the profession. I mean, good historians try and stand above their society and assess it even-handedly, and they don't become participants in particular political disputes.
The National Museum in Canberra. A review panel has been appointed by the federal government to investigate, among other things, the Indigenous exhibition, in particular the depiction of frontier conflict.
The biggest single picture of the display is a photograph of Bells Falls Gorge, and there's testimony there from the Aborigines of the Wiradjuri tribe that many of their tribespeople were killed there by white settlers, and that the ghosts can still be heard at Bells Falls Gorge.
There's a very strong settler tradition that something terrible happened around that area in the mid-1820s. And that supports a very strong tradition among the Wiradjuri people that's been passed down from one generation to the next. However, the specific incident, of course, we'll never know about.
That story is a myth. There's no evidence for it of any kind in the records in the 1820s when the event's supposed to have occurred. In fact, it first surfaced in the 20th century as a white legend. It wasn't a story that Aborigines ever told.
The museum claims it relied on hard evidence, but also acknowledged the oral traditions and stories of the Aboriginals. However, since Windschuttle's complaint, the museum has been forced to qualify some of the claims made in displays.
If we'd made errors, if various things were ambiguous or questionable, we would look at them very closely. Now, when the section on frontier conflict was in fact questioned, that's in fact what we did. If it turns out that Keith Windschuttle is correct in relation to other matters, we would certainly look very closely at the evidence, we would seek additional advice, and if necessary, we would make appropriate changes.
Windschuttle dismisses accusations of a right-wing agenda.
Whatever I say, people won't believe it. They'll all say, oh, he's a political operative. But that is, in fact, the case.
By following that trail of historians' footnotes, Windschuttle uncovers damning evidence of fudged figures and exaggerated claims.
Well, in some cases, there are claims by the historians I'm criticising that can be shown to be absolutely false. People who were supposed to be on the spot were somewhere else. And there are other cases where historians, Lyndall Ryan has made a whole range of claims about events that happened, and she's given footnotes to them, as historians are supposed to do. And when you look up the footnotes, you find there's nothing there. Lyndall Ryan cites the diary of the colony's first chaplain, the Reverend Robert Knopwood, as the source for her claim that between 1804 and 1808, the colonists killed 100 Aborigines. The diaries, however, record only 4 Aborigines being killed in this period.
It's a devastating claim Ryan cannot refute.
Right. I certainly agree that the Knopwood diaries say that, but I also had another reference referring to a report by John Oxley, who was a surveyor. He said too many Aborigines were being killed.
OK, but how did you extrapolate from his words saying too many Aborigines had been killed to about 100 lost their lives?
Well, I think by the way in which Oxley wrote that he seemed to think there had been a great loss of life from the Aborigines.
So in a sense, is it fair enough for him to say that you did make up figures? You're telling me you made an estimated guess.
Yes, but historians are always making up figures.
It was here in Risdon Cove in 1804 that the first recorded shots were fired at Aboriginals by British soldiers. What happened here that day has become a seminal event in Tasmanian history. But according to Keith Windschuttle, the interpretation of events here in 1804 and others like it are central to how Aboriginal history in this country has been fabricated.
At Risdon Cove, all the evidence at the time is that there were, on the spot, by people who were there, say there were either 2 Aborigines or 3 Aborigines killed. It wasn't until 26 years later that people came along and said, oh no, I think there might have been 50 killed. And if you look at the person who said that, he wasn't there at the time.
I don't know what happened at Risdon Cove. Something happened. I myself would choose not to talk about there being a massacre there.
Yet, based on the accepted premise there was a massacre at Risdon Cove, the Tasmanian government handed back land there to the Aboriginals in 1995 as a gesture of reconciliation. This historic site of first British settlement, where the Union Jack first flew in 1803, now sits virtually unused and unkempt. The archaeological heritage of several of the first huts now overgrown or decaying. One of the foundation stones of the accepted history is Henry Reynolds' claim of the overall number of casualties suffered by Aboriginals as a result of white settlement.
It's my claim that 20,000 were killed around Australia, which I think is still a very conservative estimate.
But in his book, The Other Side of the Frontier, Henry Reynolds states that 20,000 blacks were killed before Federation. He does not tell readers that is his guess, but he now admits it's an estimate.
It is reasonable to suppose that it might have been 20,000, and that's as far as you can go.
But that figure is widely accepted as fact and quoted in much of the literature on the subject.
That's in all the standard histories. It's in the Oxford History Australia, it's in the Companion to Australian Historiography. It's a standard figure that's given by everybody, and I thought it was well backed by evidence.
Indeed, Reynolds' claim that 10,000 Aborigines were killed in Queensland is attacked by Windshuttle as baseless.
And he cites a piece of an article he wrote himself many years before as having established that fact. When I looked up the article he wrote earlier, I found it's not an article about 10,000 Aborigines being killed at all. It's an article about the number of whites who were killed by Aborigines in Queensland. So Henry had given a false citation of his claim that 10,000 Aborigines were killed. He had no basis for it.
Now, you can't count them because they aren't recorded. But reading every country newspaper in Queensland, reading every government document, 10 years of serious research, my assessment is that 10,000 is a reasonable figure. Now, whether it appears in a particular article is neither here nor there. You've just got to look at the body of the research.
If Windshuttle has scored some direct hits in round one, his next two volumes, investigating Aboriginal white conflict on the Australian mainland, will no doubt target even more fundamental issues such as land rights. The example of handing back land at Risdon Cove in reparations over a supposed massacre will mean land claims in general will be under his gun. There's no doubt that more egos and reputations will be bruised as Keith Windshuttle gets ready for round two.
Helen Daly reporting there, the producer Paul Steindl.